Wow, wow, wow. An Englishman in Germany at the circus. Feels a bit like the Euro 2024 final, but no, ladies and gents, today we're not in Berlin. You've read the title. I've no idea what the title's going to be as a film in this, but we're in Dresden. And you might be thinking, what on earth are you doing in Dresden? Wow. We like to chant about how football is coming home, even though it didn't, and it probably won't for a while. Football did come here to Dresden because this area was almost looked at as a bit of an English area all the way back in the sort of late 19th century, late 1800s, prior to any tension with wars and so on. The English were over here and they brought football with them because across these parks is the current home of Dynamo Dresden, which we are hoping to check out today as well. But it's significant for us English, and it's a video you're going to enjoy it too if you're German. You're going to enjoy it if you're Italian, Spanish. You'll probably love it if you're Spanish. You can take the piss out of me looking like Billy Idol. Yeah, if you're wondering why I've got awful hair, I tried to look like Paul Gascoigne for the Euro 2024 final. I failed with my hair dyeing, just as England failed with bringing it home. But as I said, I'm bringing you an awesome video because let's head over to the site where football first started outside of Britain. I'm really baffled as to why more isn't made of that. Why aren't more people visiting this site? This is monumental. So ladies and gents, we've had to have a quick pit stop under the Ultras shelter here because despite being absolutely boiling, we're encountering a little bit of rain, but it's fine because I've done some more research, and according to Wikipedia, this site, the site whereby, as you can see, the Dynamo Dresden stadium is in the distance, this was quite an affluent area of Dresden. Now, the English that are over here, they were very unlike the English you know of, and I'm sure you probably dislike today. No kind of working class yobs were around here. These were very much the middle class. They weren't the aristocrats, but they weren't the peasants. They were wealthy English people who, on this land, for about 110 years, would play a variety of sports, not just football. They had cricket pitches here and so on. And that was pretty much the way for a long time. But again, according to Wikipedia, in the 1870s, they set up a football club called DEFC. Now, I'm sure you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know what that abbreviation stands for. The Dresden something Football Club. The Dresden English Football Club. So I know personally quite a few people in England who follow Dynamo Dresden, and a couple of those are Wolves fans, and I thought, well, it must be to do with the colour scheme because Dynamo Dresden play in colours very similar to Wolverhampton Wanderers. But obviously the link to English people, as I said, dates back centuries. So I mean, I'm growing more fond of them by the day. I'm not fond of this horrible rain though. But let's go and head towards the ground, because I don't think it's just where the ground is. I believe where I am now would have been part of that English district in Dresden. I mean, these roads back in the day probably, as I said, probably had cricket pitches on them and a variety of sporting activities took place. Rather than just keep calling it the Dynamo Dresden Stadium, let's give it its correct name. It's currently being called the Rudolf Harbig Stadion. Now, it's changed name many a times over the years, but as I look at Wikipedia, it looks as though it was called that from 1951 to 1971. It looks like they maybe took on a couple of sponsorship names, but for a while now it's been called the Rudolf Harbig Stadion, who was apparently an athlete, maybe even a world record breaking runner, possibly. Again, Wikipedia, pinch of salt and all that. But before we go and have a little look at that wonderful stadium, let's keep this exploring on the go, because I'm in awe, because again, they can't actually prove it, I don't think, because there might have been football clubs knocking around on the sly before the internet, and the world was a different place, of course. But many people consider Dresden English Football Club as not only Germany's first ever football club. Now we're talking about the football we know and love, modern day football, the Cambridge rules and all that. But not only does that make Dresden English Football Club the very first football club in Germany, it also makes it the very first football club, again, as I said at the start of the video, outside of Britain. As a reminder, when we sing "Football's Coming Home," as much as it comes across in an arrogant way, and again, there's the basics of that song is two comedians and a pretty unknown band came together to create a light-hearted, fun, piss-takey football song, whereby it took the mick out of ourselves. It shouldn't be taken seriously, but the lyrics of "Football's Coming Home" were because obviously the Euros were in England in 1996, where obviously football was born. Football came from England, so when we say football's coming home, football genuinely did come home for that tournament. We're not talking about the trophy. So it completely makes sense that football would have started by English people here in Germany. So I think I'm going to make this a two-part video. I'm going to make this specifically about the history of German football starting from here, and then I think we're going to do a separate video more on Dynamo Dresden as a club, because I don't know how close we can get to getting inside and looking at the pitch. Probably not. But when we were at Leipzig yesterday looking around the Red Bull Arena, I noticed some weird statues of naked blokes with their willy out. And I've noticed one here as well. What is this, a traditional thing around German football grounds? We've got a man here with a ball in his hand and then a couple of balls in between his legs. Bit weird. Again, there's a lot of similarities between England and Germany, but I have found that the settings around the football grounds couldn't be more different, because in England, our old school football grounds are set amongst terraced housing and so on. I find that German football grounds are a little bit more scenic. They've got a lot of trees around them, and they tend to not be in quite as built up areas. And obviously, as I said, they've got naked men knocking around the stadium as well. Well, that said, maybe it is a bit similar, because we've got half naked blokes with their bellies out knocking around English grounds, haven't we? So again, I'm sure not only you Dynamo Dresden fans, but German football fans in general can point me as to exactly where those initial pitches lay. There was apparently tennis played here as well, and I've just looked. I know it's not tennis, it's volleyball, I think. So those traditions are still very much alive. But again, as a stark contrast, in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, Dynamo English Football Club would fold. A weird fact though, they went like 20 years without ever losing. I think they went like 20 years without ever conceding a goal as well, which does sound a little bit like match fixing. So maybe football hasn't changed all that much since back then. But Dynamo Dresden weren't founded until a long time after. They were founded in the 1950s by East German police. Obviously by this point, Germany was split into two separate entities, East and West Germany. And Dynamo Dresden, since then as a club, are one of Germany's, or East Germany's, most successful football clubs. So as I said at the start of the video, they play in similar colours to Wolverhampton Wanderers, Wolves, as most of you know them as. But Dynamo, or Dresden English, should I say? I keep saying Dynamo English. Dresden English, they didn't play in those colours. But Dynamo Dresden does have a bit of red in their badge. I don't know if that's a nod to Dresden English, because again, as I looked at Wikipedia, Dresden English played in colours very similar to Ajax. They've got the home strip, basically the same as the Ajax home strip. But as I said, they folded in the late 19th century, again, 1898, to be Pacific, as a lot of people say, 126 years ago. I keep wanting to talk about Dynamo Dresden, but again, I'm going to hold off. But initial first impressions are the similarities between Alemannia Aachen. We had the pleasure of being there in that game whereby Alemannia Aachen got into the Dry Liga, because they're going to be playing Dynamo Dresden this season. As Dynamo Dresden play in Germany's third division, started to drift out. I'm going too much into Dynamo Dresden, ladies and gents. I need to get away from here. We'll come back for that second video. Let's talk a little bit more about the beginnings of German football.
So hang on. Naturally, when you make videos like this, you're always going to get people who oppose the claim of being the oldest. I've made videos on oldest English football clubs, English football stadiums, oldest stadiums in the world. Someone's always got a counter argument, and that's great because reality is, as I said earlier, you can't actually really prove it because this is a long time ago. Football would have been played to a different extent prior to this, you know, but the football at the time wouldn't have resembled anything close to the football we all know and love today. We're talking modern football, as I said. The Dresden English Football Club were apparently the first of its kind with the modern rules and so on. If you are to do research though on the history of football in Germany, they'll very much have Berlin as the hotspot for early football in Germany. And again, I can understand why, because if you Google the oldest German football club, they're going to bring up the currently still active oldest German football club being BFC Germania, 1888. Now, obviously, these are a Berlin-based club, and they would play fellow Berlin-based clubs. There'd be a bit of a Berlin football league. A lot of people recognise this as one of the earliest German football leagues. I think it was called, according to my notes, the BDF, the Bund Deutscher Fußballspieler. But a lot of these clubs also had influence from English expats or British expats, so the tie to English football is still very close, whichever way you want to look at it. And that's not just me being English trying to claim something, because we can't claim a bloody title. I'm proud of English football history, and I'm proud of the history of football across the world. Football unites people. I've got to have something to get excited about if the English national team aren't going to do that for me, are they? But you might be asking, well, Roy, what about clubs like VfL Bochum in their badge 1848? What about clubs like 1860 Munich? Well, the difference with German clubs and English clubs is a lot of German clubs are basically sport clubs, kind of most famous for their football clubs. Now, these dates, like 1848, refer back to the original incarnation of the club, but that club would mainly be like a gymnastics club, an athletics club. They'd maybe even play cricket and other sports as well. Like 1860 Munich, for example, they wouldn't start playing football until a later, or at least later than BFC Germania 1888. So even though they're an older club, they're not an older football club, if that makes sense. It's similar to when we spoke about Bramall Lane being the oldest stadium that still hosts football, but it's not the oldest football stadium because it didn't host football. Football would have been played probably worldwide to an extent with something that resembled a ball, but again, it would have been unrecognisable. It might have been more like rugby. They'd been picking it up. It'd have been a free-for-all. So again, let me know in the comments below if you feel otherwise. From research alone, I believe Dresden English Football Club was indeed the very first football club outside of Britain to be started in a modern incarnation. Ladies and gents, apologies. I've been incredibly ill last few days. Serious case of man flu. My throat is on fire. But we are going to get part 2 when we speak about the modern Dresden Football Club, Dynamo Dresden. I keep saying Dynamo Dresden. It's very difficult because this is an English-based football channel, and I just happen to have fallen in love with German football along the way. So predominantly the audience of this channel is English, but we're getting more and more German subscribers. So there's a dilemma as to how to pronounce things. Like I've just said 1860 Munich. I don't think I'm going to go all the way and say München. However, go easy on me with pronunciations because you're going to get a bit of a blend of both. So in part 2, we're going to take a look at Dynamo Dresden, which again is it's an incredible story because not only have I fallen in love with German football, but I've gone off on a tangent from this last trip. I've also become incredibly intrigued about East German football. Obviously, the country was divided into two for a number of decades, and East German football, I think, often gets overlooked. The big clubs from the East German side have fallen down the leagues, and for me, on the channel right now, as much as we're going to look at Bundesliga, Zweite Bundesliga, Dry Liga and so on, I really want to shed some spotlight on some of those East German fallen giants. So check out part 2 of this video on Dynamo Dresden, coming up hopefully tomorrow if you're watching this as it's been uploaded. If you're watching this a little bit after, there is going to be a link at the end of this video to part 2 and a link in the description below. So check out those videos, subscribe for not only German football content. This week I'm off to film a very nostalgic piece in London for one of our favourite TV shows we had here in Britain as a kid. So make sure you stay tuned for that one, and I'll see you in a future video. I'll see you there.